Here are some shorts that have questions for atheists.
This is a question that I always like to ask atheists. Do you believe all modern science that said the universe has a beginning?
Well, all modern science doesn't say that. Alan Guth, one of the authors of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is often cited as proof that the universe has a beginning, is of the opinion that actually the universe may not have a beginning.
Because even atheist scientists like, Stephen Hawking will say, okay, yes, the universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago.
I don't know if he uses those exact words, but even if the universe had a beginning, that doesn't mean that it came into existence. In order for something to come into existence, there has to be a time when it didn't exist, followed by a time when it did. Otherwise, there's no existence to come into. Since the universe is the space-time continuum, it includes all of time. Therefore, there could never have been a time when the universe didn't exist. Therefore, even if it hasn't existed for an infinite amount of time, it still didn't come into existence. Since it has existed for as long as time has existed, it has, in that sense, always existed, even if it has only existed for a finite amount of time.
So if it came into being, logic tells us that anything that began to exist had to have a cause.
No, logic does not tell us that. Causation is not a part of logic. Even William Lane Craig, the most prominent proponent of this argument, does not say that this premise is based in logic. Rather, he makes an inductive argument for it. He says that we never see things pop into existence without something causing them to, therefore it is very unlikely that the universe popped into existence uncaused. However, I don't believe that the universe did pop into existence, because that would also imply that there must have been existence temporarily prior to the universe, which by definition could not be the case.
And therefore the universe began to exist. Therefore the universe had to have a cause that was outside of it. So spaceless.
Spaceless means that it doesn't exist anywhere.
Timeless.
Timeless means that it never exists.
Immaterial.
So it's made of nothing.
And extremely powerful. In other words, that's what we describe as God.
Apparently you don't realize that you effectively describe God as something that never exists anywhere.
All right, I've got 3 more questions for atheists. Here is number 1. Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence? So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it?
Generally, but that standard also depends on the stakes. If someone hands you a DVD and says, "This is the greatest movie ever made, it'll cost you 50 cents. You're not risking much by believing that person and buying that DVD. If they say, "This is the greatest movie ever made, it'll cost you $70, you're probably going to want to at least read a few reviews of it rather than just take one guy's word for it. So yes, we would generally be better off if the strength of our beliefs are proportionate to the evidence for those beliefs, but it also makes sense to weigh the stakes of believing a particular claim when deciding how much evidence to ask for it.
Number 2 is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists?
The short answer is no. First of all, how could you even identify a miracle? David Hume said that nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happened in the common course of nature. So a miracle is something that is outside the common course of nature. But how can we tell if something is outside the common course of nature? How can we be sure that something that we infer is outside the common course of nature is not a heretofore undiscovered natural occurrence? Let's say we see something that defies a law of physics. How can we tell whether that's a miracle or whether scientists have simply been mistaken about the breadth of applicability of that particular law of physics? This has happened before. The law of conservation of parity was thought to apply to all of the fundamental forces. When it was discovered that it does not apply to the weak nuclear force, scientists didn't proclaim it's a miracle. No, they revised the definition of that law to carve out what was discovered to be an exception. Given that this is how we deal with witnessing laws of physics being broken, it's not clear to me how one could tell the difference between a miracle and a phenomenon which is just a rare exception to a natural law. Secondly, even if we could confirm that a suspension of a natural law is a supernatural phenomenon, however you would do that, the simplest explanation would still not be God. The simplest explanation would be someone with some supernatural powers, not an ultimate all-powerful entity.
And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened. All right, number 3, and this is my final question. If you're an atheist that cares about truth and thinks that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, but then you also think that we've got this unique way to verify whether or not God exists through studying miracles,
Well, because I don't think we can actually identify miracles, I don't believe that this is a means of verifying the existence of any supernatural entity, let alone a god.
How many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
Do you infer that the Christian God exists from miracle reports? If you do, how many of the thousands of reports of miracles attributed to Hindu gods have you thoroughly investigated?
Let's suppose that Jesus did what you suggested, and he came right now today, and he was killed in an electric chair, and scientifically confirmed that he was dead, and then he came back to life. Would you then believe God exists and that God had raised Jesus from the dead?
No. My first inference would be that there is some heretofore undiscovered natural mechanism that makes resurrection physically possible. Just as scientists, when they discovered that the law of conservation of parity could be broken, did not infer that there is some supernatural force at work, I would not infer that there is some supernatural force that caused this person to rise from the dead. And even if I were to somehow become convinced that something magical had happened, I would simply infer that Jesus himself had some magical power. I would not infer that he or any other entity was all-powerful, because that simply wouldn't follow, and it would not be the simplest, most probable explanation.
I said, why are you an atheist? And she said, because I can only believe things that are backed up by logic and evidence. So I'm going to use her words, and I'm going to ask the next question. So what logic and evidence do you have for the belief there's no God?
Since God is defined as a timeless, spaceless entity, and since something being timeless and spaceless would mean that it exists nowhere and never, and since existing nowhere and never means not existing at all, I deduce that such an entity cannot exist by definition.
And she said, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. Now, most Christians here are going to immediately begin defending Scripture. This is where I call the lazy approach. My response wasn't to defend Scripture or give her evidence. I responded with a question. And how does that prove there's no God?
It doesn't. That was a bad answer. That only proves that not everything in the Bible can be true. It's great proof that the Bible is not infallible, but proving that the Bible is not infallible is not the same thing as proving that there is no God. If the Bible is false, that wouldn't mean that the Bhagavad Gita is false, or that any other religious text that says there is a God is false.
These are 3 questions that atheists are afraid to answer, and the last question will probably stump you. If God isn't real, then how did this entire universe form?
It didn't. There has never been a time when the universe didn't already exist.
Nextly,
is this guy a troll?
who was the first man, and how were people created?
It doesn't really make sense to speak of a first man. The speciation of the first humans from a non-human ancestor population didn't suddenly occur over the course of just one generation such that there was a first human who was born to a non-human. The process is too gradual to point precisely to one first human, and humans were created by evolution.
Lastly, if Jesus wasn't born 2023 years ago, then when did we start keeping track of the Common Era calendar year?
You could just Google this question. The Anno Domini system was invented by Dionysius Exiguus in the early 500s. I don't know why this guy prefaced his question with, if Jesus wasn't born 2023 years ago. This calendar system was invented about 1500 years ago, regardless of whether Jesus was born 2023 years ago or not.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.